Good evening. Tonight we explore a substance so woven into the fabric of human civilization that its story is inseparable from our own. This is not a tale of shadowy dealers or criminal syndicates, though they will make their appearance. This is a story of legitimacy, of a poison that built empires, financed revolutions, and killed more people than all the wars of the 20th century combined. And it did so with the full blessing of governments, the eager participation of scientists, and the sophisticated machinery of modern capitalism. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you find value in what we do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what your relationship with tobacco has been, whether personal or through loved ones. These stories matter. Now, dim the lights. Let's step into a history written in smoke. Before there was a corporation or a Surgeon General's warning or a cigarette, there was a plant. Nicotine tabacum. It grows wild and unremarkable in the warm, humid valleys of South America, particularly in the foothills of the Andes. The plant itself is surprisingly beautiful when you stop to look at it. It stands 3 to 6 feet tall, with broad, sticky leaves covered in fine hairs that trap moisture from the air. In late summer, it produces clusters of tubular flowers, delicate pink or white trumpets that open at dusk to release their fragrance. But the leaves, those large, veined, slightly oily leaves, they were the prize, and humanity's relationship with them stretches back at least 8,000 years, possibly longer. The archaeological evidence is fragmentary but suggestive. Traces of nicotine have been found in the residue of ancient pipes, in the dental calculus of pre-Columbian remains, in the paintings and carvings of cultures that flourished and vanished long before Europeans arrived. The indigenous peoples of the Americas didn't simply use tobacco. They incorporated it into the very structure of their spiritual and social lives. For the Maya, tobacco was intimately connected with the gods. It was smoked during religious ceremonies, offerings of smoke carrying prayers upward to the heavens. The Aztecs called it yetl, and believed it had protective and medicinal properties. Shamans would blow tobacco smoke over the sick, over warriors before battle, over newborn children. It was a bridge between worlds, a substance that could open the doors of perception. In the Caribbean islands, the Taino people had developed a particular method of consumption. They would roll dried tobacco leaves into a crude cylinder and light one end, inhaling the smoke through the other. They called this practice tobacco, a word that would eventually be applied to the plant itself. It was both a social ritual and a form of medicine. They used tobacco to treat headaches, wounds, and respiratory ailments, oblivious to the cruel irony that would only become apparent centuries later. Further, south in the Amazon basin, tribes cultivated dozens of varieties of tobacco, each with subtle differences in potency and flavour. Some prepared it as a powder to be snorted. Others created thick, concentrated syrups that could be drunk in ceremonial contexts, inducing powerful visions and profound nausea. The plant was not recreational in the modern sense. It was sacred technology, a tool for healing, for communion with the spirit world, for marking the passage from one state of being to another. The alkaloid responsible for tobacco's effects, nicotine, is the plant's natural defense mechanism. It's an insecticide deadly to the small creatures that might otherwise devour the leaves. A caterpillar that takes a bite of a tobacco plant will soon find its nervous system overstimulated, its muscles seizing. It's a neurotoxin, elegantly designed by millions of years of evolution. But in the right dose, delivered to a human nervous system, it does something quite different. It stimulates. It focuses the mind. It creates a brief, pleasant rush of alertness followed by a sense of calm satisfaction. The indigenous peoples understood dosage instinctively, culturally. Their use was controlled, ritualized, integrated into a larger framework of meaning. There was no concept of chain smoking, no idea of consuming tobacco from the moment you woke until the moment you slept. It was powerful medicine, treated with respect and caution. And then the ships arrived. October 12th, 1492. Christopher Columbus and his crew made landfall in the Bahamas, and with that contact, two worlds that had developed in isolation for millennia were suddenly, violently merged. The Columbian exchange that followed would reshape the globe. Potatoes, tomatoes, corn, and chocolate travelled east. Wheat, horses, cattle, and smallpox travelled west. And among the many things that crossed the Atlantic in those early years, tucked into the ships alongside gold and strange new foods, was tobacco. Columbus himself was bemused by it. In his journal entries from that first voyage, He noted with puzzlement that the natives carried with them a sort of dry herb which they valued highly. They would light it and inhale the smoke, an act that seemed to give them great pleasure and relief from fatigue. He described it as a curiosity, nothing more. The crew members who tried it found the practice strange and unpleasant. The smoke burned their throats. It made them dizzy and nauseous. They couldn't understand the appeal. But not everyone was so quick to dismiss it. A sailor named Rodrigo de Jerez became perhaps the first European to adopt the habit. He learned the practice from the Taino and continued smoking after his return to Spain. His neighbours, seeing smoke pouring from his mouth and nose, were terrified. They reported him to the Spanish Inquisition, convinced he was possessed by the devil. He was imprisoned for 7 years. By the time he was released, smoking tobacco had become fashionable across Europe. The world had caught up to him. The man who truly introduced tobacco to Europe as a valuable commodity was a Spanish physician named Francisco Hernández de Toledo. In the 1570s, he was sent to Mexico by King Philip II to study the natural resources of the New World. He returned with detailed descriptions of tobacco and its purported medicinal properties. He documented how indigenous healers used it to treat everything from toothaches to asthma, from tumours to intestinal parasites. But the true evangelist, the man who turned tobacco from an exotic novelty into a European phenomenon, was Jean Nicot, the French ambassador to Portugal. In 1560, Nicot obtained tobacco seeds and began cultivating the plant in Lisbon. He was convinced of its medicinal virtues and sent samples to the French court, including to Catherine de Medici, the Queen Mother, who suffered from terrible migraines. She found that snuffing powdered tobacco provided relief. Delighted, she became one of tobacco's most prominent advocates. Nicot's enthusiastic promotion earned him a place in history. The plant was named Nicotiana in his honour. The active alkaloid would eventually bear his name as well, nicotine. It was a fitting tribute to the man who had unleashed this substance on the European continent, though whether it was an honour or a curse would become a matter of fierce debate. Within a generation, tobacco had spread across Europe with astonishing speed. By 1600, it was being cultivated and consumed in England, France, Spain, Portugal, Italy and the Netherlands. It had reached the Ottoman Empire, where it was embraced with particular enthusiasm. Turkish merchants brought it along the Silk Road to Persia, to India, to China. Japanese traders encountered it through Portuguese merchants and brought it to the islands of Japan. This was globalization in its earliest, rawest form. A plant that had been confined to the Americas for thousands of years was suddenly everywhere, carried by the insatiable curiosity and commercial ambition of European expansion, and everywhere it went it created controversy. The early 17th century saw tobacco become the subject of one of the first great public health debates in recorded history. Medical opinion was sharply divided, often bitterly so. On one side were the physicians and apothecaries who saw tobacco as a miracle drug, a universal panacea. They prescribed it for an astonishing array of ailments: plague, scurvy, poisoning, kidney stones, gout, worms, halitosis, and even cancer. It was thought to dry out excess moisture in the body, a concept derived from the ancient humoral theory of medicine. Treatises were written extolling its virtues. Nicolas Menards, a Spanish physician, published a widely read book in 1571 titled Joyful News Out of the New World, in which he described tobacco as a cure for 36 different diseases. The book was translated into multiple languages and became a bestseller. Tobacco was marketed not as a vice, but as a health product, a natural remedy straight from the New World's pharmacy. But there were dissenters, and they were loud. The most famous was King James III of England, who in 1604 published a scathing treatise titled A Counterblast to Tobacco. It was a remarkable document, perhaps the first major anti-smoking polemic in history. James pulled no punches. He described smoking as a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs, and in the black stinking fume thereof, nearest resembling the horrible Stygian smoke of the pit that is bottomless. He railed against the immorality of the practice, the waste of money it represented, and most presciently, the way it seemed to enslave its users. He noted with disgust how men who took up the habit found themselves unable to stop, how they would smoke constantly, in their homes, in taverns, even in church. He saw addiction, though he lacked that precise word for it, and he recognised it as a social ill. James backed his rhetoric with action. He imposed a massive tax increase on tobacco imports, raising the duty by 4,000% virtually overnight. It was an early attempt at what we might today call a sin tax, designed to discourage consumption through price. It failed spectacularly. People simply paid the higher price. The revenue flowed into the royal treasury, and James, recognising a golden goose when he saw one, quietly abandoned his moral crusade. The king who had called tobacco the devil's weed became its most profitable taxman. The moral and medical debates raged across Europe and beyond. The Russian Tsar Mikhail I banned smoking in 1634, declaring it a sin. Violators could have their noses slit or be exiled to Siberia. The Ottoman Sultan Murad IV, a puritanical and brutal ruler, banned tobacco in 1633 and enforced the decree with executions. Smokers were beheaded, hanged, or quartered in public squares. In Japan, the Tokugawa shogunate issued repeated bans throughout the 17th century. None of it worked. Every ban was eventually lifted or simply ignored. The plant was too profitable, too enjoyable, too deeply embedded in social rituals. Tobacco had crossed a threshold. It was no longer just a crop or a medicine. It had become a habit, a comfort, a necessity. The human brain, once introduced to nicotine's peculiar chemistry, wanted more. While Europe debated tobacco's morality, a struggling English colony on the swampy coast of North America was discovering that tobacco could be something even more valuable than medicine or vice. It could be money. Jamestown, Virginia, established in 1607, was a disaster. The settlers, many of them gentlemen adventurers expecting to find gold, were woefully unprepared for the brutal realities of survival. They starved. They died of disease. They fought with the indigenous Powhatan Confederacy. By 1610, the colony was on the brink of total collapse. Of the original 500 settlers, only 60 remained alive. What saved Jamestown was not gold or religious zeal or military prowess. It was a plant. In 1612, a settler named John Rolfe, who would later marry Pocahontas, began experimenting with tobacco cultivation. The local Virginia tobacco was harsh and unpalatable to European tastes. But Rolfe had obtained seeds of a Caribbean variety, probably smuggled from Spanish-controlled Trinidad. He crossed it with the local plants and discovered he could produce a milder, sweeter tobacco that Europeans would eagerly buy. The first shipment, 4 barrels, was sent to England in 1614. It sold immediately. The Virginia Company, which financed the colony, saw their salvation. They pushed for more. Every available plot of land in Jamestown was soon planted with tobacco. Settlers grew it in their gardens, in the streets, even in the marketplace. The obsession was total. The economics were irresistible. A farmer could make 6 times more profit growing tobacco than growing food crops. The market in England seemed bottomless. Within a decade, Virginia was exporting 50,000 pounds of tobacco annually. By 1630, that number had exploded to 1.5 million pounds. The colony that had nearly failed was suddenly prosperous, its survival guaranteed by a cash crop. But this prosperity came at a terrible cost, a cost that would shape American history for the next 250 years. Tobacco cultivation was brutally labour-intensive. The plants required constant attention. They had to be carefully transplanted, weeded, pruned, and topped to prevent flowering. The leaves had to be harvested individually as they ripened, then hung and cured for weeks. It was backbreaking work under the merciless Virginia sun. Initially, the labour came from indentured servants, poor Europeans who agreed to work for a set number of years in exchange for passage to the New World. But there were never enough of them. The mortality rate was staggering, and those who survived their terms of servitude often headed west to claim their own land. The plantation owners needed a labour force that was larger, cheaper, and most importantly, permanent. They found their solution in the transatlantic slave trade. The first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, just a few years after Rolfe's first successful harvest. Initially, their status was ambiguous, closer to indentured servitude than chattel slavery. But as the tobacco economy grew, as the demand for labour became insatiable, the legal and social structures of racial slavery were methodically constructed. By the 1660s, Virginia had passed a series of laws that made slavery hereditary and race-based. The The children of enslaved mothers would be enslaved for life. Freedom became a privilege reserved for white skin. The wealth generated by tobacco built the plantation aristocracy of the South. Men like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison owed their fortunes to tobacco grown by enslaved labor. Tobacco didn't just fund slavery, it required slavery to be profitable at the scale demanded by European markets. The two institutions grew together, intertwined like roots and soil. The beautiful rhetoric of liberty and democracy that would pour from Virginia in the 18th century, the soaring words of the Declaration of Independence, were written by men whose wealth was extracted from the bodies of enslaved people working in tobacco fields. The irony was profound and poisonous. The crop that Europeans associated with freedom, with the New World's promise, with personal pleasure and relaxation, was built on the most complete denial of freedom imaginable. Every puff of smoke in a London coffee house, every pinch of snuff in a Parisian salon, was made possible by the lash and the chain. Tobacco became currency. Debts were paid in pounds of tobacco. Brides' dowries were calculated in tobacco. Taxes were collected in tobacco. It was quite literally the lifeblood of the colonial economy. When the American Revolution erupted in 1775, one of the colony's most valuable bargaining chips in securing French support was the promise of tobacco exports. The revolution itself was partially financed by tobacco sales to Europe. The plant that King James had called loathsome had become the foundation of a nation, and the addiction of European consumers had created an economic system that would take a civil war to dismantle, leaving scars that have never fully healed. The sacred leaf of the indigenous peoples had been transformed into something entirely different, an engine of empire built on stolen land and worked by stolen people. For most of tobacco's history in Europe and America, it was consumed in a variety of forms, but rarely as we know it today. Wealthy gentlemen snuffed powdered tobacco through the nose. Sailors and working men chewed it, spitting the brown juice into brass spittoons. Pipes were ubiquitous, their smoke filling taverns and drawing rooms. Cigars, imported from Cuba and hand-rolled, were a luxury item for the prosperous. Cigarettes existed but were marginal, hand-rolled, and associated with the poor or the exotic. Turkish soldiers smoked them. So did certain bohemian artists in Paris. In the United States, cigarettes were sometimes called coffin nails or little cigars, and they carried a faint whiff of moral dubiousness. They were too convenient, too easy, too fast. Real tobacco connoisseurs preferred the ritual and craft of pipes and cigars. Everything changed with two developments: mechanization and war. The first development came in 1880, when James Bonsack, a young inventor from Virginia, patented a machine that could roll cigarettes automatically. Before Bonsack, cigarettes were rolled by hand. A skilled worker could produce perhaps 3,000 a day. Bonsack's machine, a complex contraption of gears, belts, and blades, could produce 120,000 cigarettes a day. It was a quantum leap in manufacturing capacity. James Buchanan Duke, a North Carolina tobacco baron, immediately recognized the potential. He acquired the rights to the Bonsack machine and built his empire on its efficiency. He could produce cigarettes more cheaply than anyone else and flood the market with his product. But volume alone wasn't enough. He needed to create demand, and so Duke became one of the pioneers of modern advertising. He hired the best artists to design colourful, collectible cigarette cards that came with each pack, featuring baseball players, actresses, and exotic scenes from around the world. He plastered billboards across cities. He gave away free samples by the millions. He targeted women, a largely untapped market, with advertising that suggested smoking was a symbol of independence and sophistication. He created brands with evocative names: Duke of Durham, Crosscut, Cameo. Duke's tactics worked. By 1890, he controlled 40% of the American cigarette market. By 1900, he had consolidated his competitors into a monopolistic trust, the American Tobacco Company, which controlled 90% of all cigarette, cigar, and smoking tobacco production in the United States. He was called the Tobacco King, one of the most powerful industrialists in the country. But the second development, war, was what truly embedded the cigarette into the fabric of modern life. World War I was a war of trenches, of mud and wire, and endless waiting punctuated by moments of unspeakable violence. Soldiers on all sides, but particularly the British, French, and American forces, were issued cigarettes as part of their rations. Smoking was encouraged. It calmed nerves. It gave men something to do with their hands during the interminable hours between attacks. It was a small comfort in an incomprehensible hell. The military demand was staggering. The British Army alone distributed hundreds of millions of cigarettes to its troops. In the United States, aid organizations like the Red Cross and the YMCA launched massive campaigns to send cigarettes to the soldiers. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, famously cabled Washington in 1917. Tobacco is as indispensable as the daily ration. We must have thousands of tons without delay. The cigarette became a symbol of the soldier, of masculinity, of courage under fire. The image of a soldier, rifle in one hand, cigarette dangling from his lips, became iconic. When those soldiers returned home, they brought the habit with them. Millions of young men who had never smoked before the war came back addicted to nicotine, and the tobacco companies were ready with sophisticated advertising campaigns designed to keep them as customers for life. The 1920s and 30s saw the cigarette fully normalized in American and European society. Hollywood embraced it. Movie stars smoked on screen constantly. Humphrey Bogart, Bette Davis, James Cagney. They made smoking look cool, dangerous, romantic. Cigarette companies paid for product placement, ensuring their brands were visible in the most popular films of the era. Women were specifically targeted with campaigns that linked smoking to liberation and weight control. The American Tobacco Company's campaign for Lucky Strike cigarettes in 1929 featured the slogan, "Reach for a Lucky instead of a Sweet," explicitly marketing cigarettes as a diet aid. Another campaign encouraged women to "torches of freedom" by lighting up in public, framing smoking as a feminist act. It worked. Female smoking rates began to climb. By 1940, Americans were smoking 182 billion cigarettes a year, roughly 1/800 per adult. The industry had annual revenues of $1.6 billion. Tobacco companies were among the largest advertisers in the nation, sponsoring radio shows, sports events, and eventually television programs. They were respected corporate citizens. Their executives were invited to the White House, and their products were ubiquitous. The cigarette had completed its transformation. It was no longer a curiosity or a vice. It was a consumer product, as American as baseball and apple pie, a small white cylinder of rolled tobacco that had become the most efficient nicotine delivery system ever devised. Convenient, portable, socially acceptable, and devastatingly addictive. And no one, not the companies, not the government, not the doctors, publicly acknowledged what a small number of researchers were beginning to suspect in their laboratories, that this product was killing people by the millions. The first whispers of concern came not from moralists or preachers, but from physicians who were seeing something new and troubling in their practices. In the early decades of the 20th century, lung cancer was a medical rarity, a disease so uncommon that when a doctor encountered a case, it was often written up as a curiosity for medical journals. Autopsies from the late 19th century showed that lung cancer accounted for less than 1% of all cancer deaths. But by the 1930s, that was changing. Lung cancer rates were climbing, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. Physicians in major cities, particularly in Germany, Britain, and the United States, began to notice the pattern. The disease that had been rare was becoming common, and most of the patients who presented with lung cancer had one thing in common: they were heavy smokers. The first rigorous scientific evidence came from Nazi Germany, an uncomfortable historical irony that would complicate tobacco control efforts for decades. German researchers in the 1930s, supported by Hitler's government, which was ideologically opposed to smoking, conducted some of the earliest case control studies. They interviewed lung cancer patients about their smoking histories and compared them to healthy controls. The correlation was clear and strong. Smokers were far more likely to develop lung cancer. But this research, published in German medical journals, was largely ignored by the international community after World War II. The findings were tainted by their association with the Nazi regime. Science that came from such a morally compromised source was dismissed or downplayed. The tobacco industry would later exploit this historical accident, suggesting that concerns about smoking were rooted in anti-freedom, totalitarian thinking. The real breakthrough came in the late 1940s and early 1950s, when two landmark studies were published in mainstream American and British medical journals, studies that could not be dismissed or ignored. In 1950, Ernst Winder and Everts Graham in the United States, and Richard Doll and Austin Bradford Hill in the United Kingdom, independently published case control studies linking cigarette smoking to lung cancer. Both studies were methodologically rigorous, involving thousands of patients. The findings were unambiguous. Cigarette smokers had a dramatically elevated risk of developing lung cancer. The more cigarettes smoked, and the longer the duration of smoking, the higher the risk. Richard Doll's study was particularly powerful because Doll himself was a smoker who had assumed the research would exonerate the habit. When he saw his own data, he immediately quit. He then launched a long-term prospective study, following 40,000 British doctors over decades to track their smoking habits and health outcomes. The results, published throughout the 1950s and 60s, were devastating. Smoking was not just linked to lung cancer, it was linked to heart disease, stroke, emphysema, and a host of other deadly conditions. The evidence was overwhelming. The medical community began to turn. Articles appeared in the most prestigious journals. The American Cancer Society, the American Heart Association, and other health organizations issued statements urging caution. In 1957, Surgeon General Leroy Burney declared that the evidence showed a causal relationship between smoking and lung cancer. It was a watershed moment, the first time the US government had officially acknowledged the danger. But acknowledgement is not action, and the tobacco industry, faced with an existential threat, did not panic. They organized. On December 15, 1953, the chief executives of America's largest tobacco companies met at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. They had been summoned by the public relations firm Hill & Knowlton, which had been hired to manage what was shaping up to be a crisis. The scientific evidence linking smoking to cancer was mounting, and the companies needed a strategy. The strategy they devised was brilliant, cynical, and devastatingly effective. They would not deny the science directly. That would be too crude, too easily refuted. Instead, they would create doubt. They would fund their own research, form their own scientific organizations, and manufacture a debate where none existed in the legitimate scientific community. They would turn the question of smoking and health into a controversy, a he-said-she-said argument, and they would ensure that their side was always well-funded and highly visible. On January 4, 1954, tobacco companies published a full-page advertisement in 448 newspapers across the country, reaching an estimated 43 million Americans. It was titled, "A Frank Statement to Cigarette Smokers." The ad was a masterpiece of misdirection. It expressed concern about the public's health, acknowledged that there were questions about smoking, and pledged the company's commitment to getting to the truth. It announced the formation of the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, which would fund independent scientific research into the health effects of smoking. It sounded responsible. It sounded like transparency. But it was the opening salvo in a decades-long campaign of deception. The Tobacco Industry Research Committee, later renamed the Council for Tobacco Research, did fund research, but its primary purpose was not discovery. It was distraction. The organization funded studies on everything except the link between smoking and disease. They studied stress, genetics, air pollution, diet, anything that could suggest alternative explanations for rising lung cancer rates. And when they did fund studies on smoking, they carefully selected researchers who were sympathetic to the industry, or whose work could be interpreted ambiguously. More insidiously, the industry hired scientists, often respected academics, to serve as consultants. These scientists would testify in court, speak at conferences, and write opinion pieces casting doubt on the anti-smoking research. They weren't asked to prove smoking was safe. They were asked to suggest that the question was still open, that more research was needed, that the evidence was not yet conclusive. This strategy of manufactured doubt was borrowed from other industries that had faced similar crises. It had been used by the asbestos industry, by the lead industry, and it would later be used by the fossil fuel industry to delay action on climate change. The playbook was simple. Find the small uncertainties in any scientific research, magnify them, fund contrarian scientists, and insist that no action should be taken until absolute certainty was achieved. And since science never deals in absolute certainty, this was a strategy for infinite delay. Internal documents, which would only come to light decades later through lawsuits, reveal that tobacco executives knew the truth. They knew smoking caused cancer. They knew nicotine was addictive. As early as the 1960s, their own research confirmed what the independent scientists were saying, but publicly they maintained the charade. In 1994, the CEOs of the 7 largest tobacco companies were called to testify before Congress. One by one, they were asked under oath whether they believed nicotine was addictive. One by one, they said no. It was a lie, a brazen, coordinated lie, told to the American people and to the world. The footage of that hearing, 7 powerful men in expensive suits raising their hands and denying the obvious, became one of the defining images of corporate malfeasance in American history. But by then, the damage was done. For 40 years, the industry had successfully delayed meaningful regulation. They had kept the debate alive in the public mind, even as the scientific consensus became ironclad. They had protected their profits while millions of their customers died. The Surgeon General's warning. On January 11, 1964, Surgeon General Luther Terry stood before a packed room of journalists in the State Department auditorium in Washington, D.C. He was about to release a report that would change public health policy forever. The report, officially titled Smoking and Health, Report of the Advisory Committee to the Surgeon General, was the result of more than a year of exhaustive review by a panel of 10 experts. The timing of the press conference was deliberate. It was held on a Saturday morning to minimize the impact on the stock market. The tobacco company's stocks were expected to plummet. Terry's statement was unequivocal. Cigarette smoking, he announced, was a health hazard of sufficient importance to warrant appropriate remedial action. The report concluded that smoking caused lung cancer in men, probably caused lung cancer in women, and was the most important cause of chronic bronchitis. It linked smoking to heart disease and emphysema. It estimated that the average smoker had a 9 to 10 times greater risk of developing lung cancer than a non-smoker. The report was front-page news across the country. It was a bombshell. For the first time, the full weight of the US government was behind the statement that smoking kills. The reaction was immediate. Within 3 months, cigarette consumption dropped by 20%. It rebounded somewhat, but never fully recovered. The Surgeon General's report had broken the spell. The regulatory response, however, was painfully slow. The tobacco industry fought every proposed restriction with ferocious lobbying and legal challenges. But gradually, piece by piece, the edifice of smoking's social acceptability began to crack. In 1965, Congress passed the Federal Cigarette Labeling and Advertising Act, requiring a health warning on cigarette packages. The first warning was weak, almost apologetic. Caution: cigarette smoking may be hazardous to your health. The word may was a victory for the industry's lobbyists, but it was a start. In 1971, cigarette advertising was banned from television and radio. The industry, which had spent billions creating iconic campaigns, Joe Camel, the Marlboro Man, was suddenly cut off from the most powerful medium of the 20th century. They pivoted to print, to sponsorships, to product placement, but they had lost their most effective tool. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, the evidence continued to mount. Second-hand smoke was found to be dangerous, causing cancer and heart disease in non-smokers. This finding was perhaps even more important than the original research on direct smoking. It reframed the issue from one of personal choice to one of public health. Your decision to smoke was harming the people around you. The libertarian argument that smoking was a private matter collapsed. Cities and states began to pass smoking bans, first in hospitals and schools, then in offices, then in restaurants and bars. What had once been unthinkable, asking someone to put out their cigarette in a public place, became not just acceptable, but legally mandated. Smokers, who had been the majority, became a shrinking minority, increasingly pushed to the literal margins, huddled outside doorways in the rain. The tobacco companies, facing declining sales in the West, turned their attention to the developing world. Africa, Asia, Latin America, regions with weak regulations and growing middle classes, became the new frontier. Cigarette consumption in the United States and Europe began to fall, but globally it continued to rise. The death toll simply shifted geography. By the 1990s, the industry was facing a new threat: litigation. For decades, smokers had tried and failed to sue tobacco companies, arguing that cigarettes had killed their loved ones. The industry's defense was always the same: the risks were known, smoking was a choice, and individual responsibility absolved the companies of liability. They never lost. But in the mid-1990s, a new wave of lawsuits changed the equation. These were not individual cases, but massive class actions brought by state governments seeking to recover the healthcare costs of treating smoking-related diseases. The discovery process in these lawsuits forced tobacco companies to turn over internal documents. What emerged was damning. The documents revealed the industry's decades-long campaign of deception. Memos showed executives discussing nicotine addiction and ways to manipulate nicotine levels in cigarettes to keep users hooked. Research showed that companies had deliberately marketed to children, despite public denials. The Joe Camel campaign, for instance, was found to be as recognizable to 6-year-olds as Mickey Mouse. In 1998, facing potentially catastrophic legal judgments, the major tobacco companies agreed to the Master Settlement Agreement with 46 states. They agreed to pay $206 billion over 25 years to fund anti-smoking campaigns and to submit to restrictions on marketing and advertising. It was the largest civil settlement in US history. But it was not a victory. It was a negotiated surrender that left the industry intact and profitable. The companies were not shut down. Cigarettes were not banned. The payments, large as they sounded, amounted to a small fraction of the industry's revenue. And crucially, the settlement granted the companies immunity from future lawsuits by states. It was, in effect, a business expense, the cost of doing business in a more hostile regulatory environment. The Surgeon General's warning had been issued in 1964. It would take more than 3 decades for meaningful consequences to follow. And in those 3 decades, tens of millions of people died from smoking-related diseases. The wheels of justice, when they finally turned, ground slowly and incompletely. To understand why tobacco has been so difficult to abandon, despite overwhelming evidence of its dangers, we must turn our attention inward to the intricate machinery of the human brain and the peculiar chemistry of nicotine. Nicotine is a small, elegant molecule. Its chemical formula is C10H2N2. When you light a cigarette, the heat vaporizes the nicotine from the tobacco. It's carried in tiny droplets of tar and smoke deep into the lungs. The lungs, with their vast surface area of delicate alveoli designed to extract oxygen from air, are equally efficient at absorbing nicotine. From the lungs, nicotine enters the bloodstream. Within 7 seconds, faster than a heroin injection, it reaches the brain. This speed is crucial. The human brain is wired to respond to rapid changes in its chemical environment. The faster a drug reaches the brain, the more reinforcing it becomes, the more the brain learns to associate the action of smoking with the reward that follows. Once in the brain, nicotine binds to receptors designed for acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter involved in muscle movement, breathing, heart rate, learning, and memory. But nicotine doesn't just bind to these receptors, it overstimulates them. The result is a cascade of neurochemical changes. The most important is the release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, the brain's reward center. Dopamine is the currency of pleasure, the signal that tells your brain, "This is good. Remember this. Do it again." Food releases dopamine, sex releases dopamine, cocaine and amphetamines release dopamine in massive floods. Nicotine releases it in smaller but perfectly timed pulses, creating a pattern of reinforcement that is exquisitely calibrated to create habit. But nicotine does something else, something more insidious. With repeated exposure, the brain responds by creating more acetylcholine receptors. This is called upregulation. The brain is essentially saying, "If you're going to keep flooding me with this chemical, I'll build more docks for it to land on." Within weeks of regular smoking, a person can have twice as many of these receptors as a non-smoker. This is the physical basis of addiction. Those extra receptors need to be stimulated. When they're not, when nicotine levels drop, the brain sends urgent signals of distress. The smoker feels irritable, anxious, unable to concentrate. They feel a gnawing emptiness that is both physical and psychological. The only thing that relieves it is another cigarette. This is why quitting is so difficult. It's not a matter of willpower or moral strength. It's a matter of brain chemistry. The smoker isn't weak. Their brain has been physically altered by the drug. To quit, they must endure weeks or months of neurochemical imbalance, while their brain slowly downregulates those excess receptors, returning to a pre-smoking baseline. And nicotine has another trick. It's both a stimulant and a sedative, depending on the dose and the context. In small doses, it increases alertness and concentration. It helps you focus, helps you wake up. In larger doses, or when you're already stressed, it has a calming, almost tranquilizing effect. This dual action means that smokers use cigarettes to regulate their emotional state throughout the day. A morning cigarette to wake up, a cigarette with coffee to enhance concentration, a cigarette during a break to relax, a cigarette after a meal to aid digestion, a cigarette during stress to calm down. The cigarette becomes a tool, a Swiss Army knife for emotional regulation. And because it works, because it reliably delivers the desired effect within seconds, the behavior is powerfully reinforced. The smoker is not just addicted to nicotine, they're addicted to the ritual, to the predictable pattern of craving and satisfaction, to the feeling of control that comes from being able to modulate their own neurochemistry. The tobacco companies understood this, even if they publicly denied it. Internal documents from the 1960s and 70s show that they employed chemists and pharmacologists to study nicotine's effects. They referred to cigarettes as nicotine delivery devices. They studied ways to manipulate the pH of smoke to make nicotine more easily absorbed. They added ammonia compounds to tobacco, which freed nicotine from its salt form and allowed it to be absorbed more rapidly into the brain, a process called freebasing that is chemically similar to what cocaine users do to create crack. They engineered cigarettes to deliver nicotine in the most addictive way possible, while publicly maintaining that smoking was simply a matter of personal choice, and that nicotine was no more addictive than coffee. It was a lie built on sophisticated science, a calculated deception that exploited the very neuroscience they were studying in secret. The tragic irony is that nicotine, by itself, is not particularly harmful. It raises heart rate and blood pressure slightly, but so does a cup of coffee. The real danger comes from the delivery system. Burning tobacco creates more than 7,000 chemicals, at least 70 of which are known carcinogens. Tar coats the lungs. Carbon monoxide reduces oxygen delivery to tissues. The smoke causes chronic inflammation, which over years leads to emphysema, COPD, and cancer. Nicotine is the hook. The smoke is the killer. And the cigarette combines them in a package so convenient, so socially engineered, so perfectly designed to create and maintain addiction, that billions of people have found themselves unable to escape it, even when they desperately want to. By the end of the 20th century, tobacco had achieved a grim distinction. It had become the single leading cause of preventable death in human history. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend in their scale. In the 20th century alone, tobacco killed approximately 100 million people, more than all the wars, genocides, and natural disasters of that blood-soaked century combined. But those numbers, already staggering, were just the beginning. The World Health Organization estimates that in the 21st century, if current trends continue, tobacco will kill 1 billion people. 1 billion! It's a number so large it loses meaning, a statistical abstraction. But each one of those billion is an individual death, a person who gasped their last breath in a hospital bed, drowning in the fluid filling their lungs, their family watching helplessly. The geography of tobacco's devastation has shifted. In the 1960s, the highest smoking rates were in the developed world, in the United States, the United Kingdom, much of Western Europe. But as regulations tightened, as awareness grew, those rates began to fall. Today, smoking rates in the US have dropped from a peak of 42% of adults in 1965 to around 12% in 2020. Similar declines have occurred across the developed world. But the tobacco companies did not simply accept defeat. They globalized. They turned their attention to the developing world, to countries where regulations were weak or non-existent, where governments were more concerned with economic development than public health, where a growing middle class represented billions of potential new customers. China became the world's largest tobacco market. Today, there are more than 300 million smokers in China, more than the entire population of the United States. Chinese men have one of the highest smoking rates in the world, over 50%. The country consumes nearly 40% of all cigarettes smoked globally. The health consequences are only beginning to manifest. Chinese hospitals are seeing an explosion of lung cancer cases, and projections suggest that by 2050, tobacco-related diseases will kill 3 million Chinese annually. Indonesia is another tragedy in the making. It has one of the highest smoking rates in the world, and uniquely, a huge percentage of those smokers are children. Indonesian tobacco companies, operating in a largely unregulated market, have marketed heavily to young people. It's not uncommon to see children as young as 5 or 6 smoking. The iconic image of a 2-year-old Indonesian boy smoking 40 cigarettes a day went viral in 2010, a grotesque symbol of the industry's penetration into every corner of society. In Africa, tobacco companies have found fertile ground. As the continent's population grows and economies develop, the companies have moved in aggressively, sponsoring music festivals, sports events, and cultural activities. They distribute free cigarettes at nightclubs and concerts. They lobby governments to resist tobacco control measures, often with success. In many African countries, cigarettes are sold individually, making them affordable even to the poorest. A child can buy a single cigarette for a few cents. The tactics used in the developing world are often ones that would be illegal in the West. Cartoon characters in advertisements, celebrity endorsements, free samples distributed in schools. The companies exploit the regulatory gaps, the lack of enforcement, the fact that governments in poor countries often lack the resources to police tobacco marketing effectively. And there is a deeper, more cynical calculation at work. The tobacco industry knows that it takes decades for the health consequences of smoking to fully manifest. A teenager who starts smoking today will not develop lung cancer until they are in their 50s or 60s. By then, they will have been a customer for 40 years. The company will have extracted decades of profit before the person dies. And in countries with lower life expectancies, with less access to healthcare, many smokers will die of other causes before the tobacco-related diseases fully develop. It's a cold, actuarial bet on human suffering. The WHO has tried to fight back. In 2003, it adopted the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the first international treaty negotiated under the organization's auspices. The treaty calls for bans on tobacco advertising, promotion and sponsorship, for large graphic health warnings on cigarette packages, for smoke-free public places, and for increased taxes on tobacco products. As of 2021, 182 countries have ratified the treaty. The results, where it has been implemented strongly, have been encouraging. Australia pioneered plain packaging, removing all branding from cigarette packs and replacing it with graphic images of diseased lungs and dying patients. Studies show it works. It makes smoking less appealing, particularly to young people. Other countries have followed suit. Taxes have proven to be one of the most effective tools. Higher prices reduce consumption, particularly among young people and the poor, who are most price sensitive. But tobacco companies fight tax increases viciously, often funding front groups that claim to represent small businesses or to be concerned about smuggling, when in reality they are protecting industry profits. The battle is being fought country by country, often against well-funded industry lobbying, corrupt officials, and governments that depend on tobacco tax revenue for a significant portion of their budgets. In some countries, the tobacco industry is state-owned, creating a perverse incentive structure where the government is both the regulator and the profiteer. And there is another complication. In much of the developing world, tobacco is still grown as a cash crop, providing income to millions of small farmers. Efforts to reduce tobacco consumption run headlong into economic realities. What do you tell a farmer in Malawi or Bangladesh whose family has grown tobacco for generations, who has no other crop that will generate equivalent income? The moral clarity of tobacco control becomes murky when it collides with poverty. The global pandemic of tobacco-related disease is not an accident. It's not an unfortunate side effect of a legal product. It is the result of deliberate strategic decisions made by corporations that have always known the harm their product causes. They have exported death to the poorest and most vulnerable populations on Earth, and they have done so with the tacit permission of governments that prioritize short-term revenue over long-term public health. The death toll continues to climb. Every 6 seconds, someone in the world dies from a tobacco-related disease. As you've been reading this, dozens of people have taken their last breath because of a decision, often made decades ago, to light a cigarette. In the early 2000s, a new technology began to appear in markets around the world. It was called an electronic cigarette, or e-cigarette. The device, initially invented by a Chinese pharmacist named Hon Lik in 2003, was deceptively simple. It consisted of a battery, a heating element, and a cartridge containing a liquid solution of nicotine, propylene glycol, glycerin, and flavorings. When the user inhaled, the heating element vaporized the liquid, creating an aerosol that could be inhaled. The promise was revolutionary. Users would get their nicotine fix, satisfying their addiction, but without the combustion, without the tar, without the thousands of toxic chemicals created by burning tobacco. It was, in theory, a harm reduction tool. Not safe, but safer. Much safer. The early e-cigarettes were clunky, inefficient, and unappealing. They didn't deliver nicotine very effectively, and they didn't replicate the sensory experience of smoking, but the technology improved rapidly. By the 2010s, a new generation of devices had emerged, sleek and powerful, capable of delivering nicotine as efficiently as a cigarette. And then came Juul. Founded in 2015 by 2 Stanford graduates, Juul Labs created a device that was a design masterpiece. It looked like a USB drive, small enough to hide in your palm, stylish enough to be aspirational, but its real innovation was chemical. Juul used nicotine salts instead of freebase nicotine. This allowed them to deliver much higher concentrations of nicotine without the harsh throat hit that made other high-nicotine products unpleasant. A single Juul pod contained as much nicotine as a pack of cigarettes, delivered in a smooth, fruity-flavoured vapour. For adult smokers trying to quit, Juul was a godsend. The satisfaction was real. The harm reduction was real. Studies began to show that e-cigarettes, while not harmless, were likely 95% less harmful than combustible cigarettes. In the United Kingdom, public health authorities embraced vaping as a smoking cessation tool, encouraging smokers to switch. But Juul, whether intentionally or through willful blindness, created another problem. Their marketing, particularly on social media, was youth-oriented. Ads featured young, attractive people doing tricks with vapor clouds. The device was easy to hide from parents and teachers, and the flavours, mango, mint, creme brulee, were clearly designed to appeal to young people who had never smoked. The result was an explosion of teen vaping. Between 2017 and 2019, youth e-cigarette use in the United States increased by 135%. High schools reported that vaping in bathrooms was so common they had to install detectors. Kids called it juuling, turning the brand name into a verb. A whole new generation. Kids who would never have touched a cigarette were becoming addicted to nicotine. The public health community was torn. On one hand, if Juul and devices like it could help adult smokers quit, they could save millions of lives. On the other hand, they were creating a new cohort of nicotine-addicted young people. Was it a net benefit or a net harm? The debate became heated, sometimes vicious. Tobacco control advocates who had spent decades fighting the cigarette companies saw vaping as a new threat, a Trojan horse that would re-normalize nicotine addiction. Harm reduction advocates argued that letting perfect be the enemy of good would doom millions of smokers to continued cigarette use when a safer alternative existed. The situation was complicated by the fact that the major cigarette companies, seeing the threat to their business model, had bought into the vaping market. Altria, the parent company of Philip Morris USA and the maker of Marlboro, purchased a 35% stake in Juul for $12.8 billion in 2018. The optics were terrible. The very companies that had lied for decades about cigarettes were now positioning themselves as offering the solution. Regulations, when they came, were patchwork and reactive. The FDA banned flavoured pods except for tobacco and menthol in 2020, trying to make the products less appealing to youth. Some states raised the legal age to purchase tobacco and vaping products to 21, but enforcement was inconsistent, and then, in 2019, a new crisis emerged. People started showing up in emergency rooms with severe lung injuries. They had difficulty breathing, chest pain, vomiting. Some required intubation, some died. The media dubbed it EVALI, e-cigarette or vaping product use-associated lung injury. The public panicked. Was vaping killing people? The headlines screamed danger. States rushed to ban flavoured vaping products. The CDC issued warnings. It seemed like the promise of harm reduction had been exposed as a lie. But the truth, when it finally emerged, was more nuanced. The lung injuries were not caused by nicotine vaping products from legitimate manufacturers. They were caused by black-market THC vaping cartridges that had been cut with vitamin E acetate, an additive that, when heated and inhaled, caused severe lung damage. The crisis was a result of prohibition, of pushing cannabis users into an unregulated market where dangerous products proliferated. But the damage to vaping's reputation was done. The public conflated all vaping with the EVALI crisis. Smokers who might have switched to e-cigarettes were scared away. Some vapers went back to cigarettes, the more dangerous product, because they believed it was safer. The harm reduction paradox was in full effect. A technology that could save millions of lives was being undermined by legitimate concerns about youth use, by sensationalist media coverage, by regulatory confusion, and by the deep, justifiable distrust of an industry that had spent a century lying. The question remains unresolved. Can nicotine be decoupled from the cigarette? Can we create a world where adults who are addicted to nicotine have access to significantly less harmful products while preventing a new generation from ever starting? Or is nicotine addiction itself the problem, and any delivery system, no matter how much safer, simply perpetuates the cycle? The answer likely lies somewhere in the messy middle, in pragmatic policies that acknowledge the reality of addiction while working to minimize harm. But finding that middle ground requires trust, and trust in anything related to tobacco is in very short supply. To understand why tobacco has been so difficult to eliminate despite overwhelming evidence of its harm, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. Tobacco is phenomenally profitable, and that profit creates powerful incentives to maintain the status quo. The global tobacco industry generates more than $800 billion in revenue annually. The profit margins are extraordinary, often 40% or higher. This is because the product itself is cheap to produce. Tobacco can be grown in poor countries with low labour costs. The manufacturing process, while sophisticated, is efficient and scalable. The real value is in the brand, the distribution network, and most importantly, the addicted customer base. An adult smoker who smokes a pack a day will spend approximately $2,500 to $3,000 per year on cigarettes in the United States, more in countries with higher taxes. Over a lifetime of smoking, that's $100,000 or more. Multiply that by hundreds of millions of smokers globally, and you begin to understand the scale of the wealth being extracted. But the economics of tobacco extend far beyond the companies themselves. Governments are addicted to tobacco revenue. In many countries, tobacco taxes represent a significant portion of government budgets. In the United States, federal, state, and local governments collect more than $25 billion annually in tobacco taxes. That money funds schools, roads, healthcare programs. Politicians are understandably reluctant to kill the goose that lays golden eggs, even when that goose is also killing their constituents. This creates a perverse incentive. Governments have a financial interest in maintaining a certain level of smoking. Not too high, because the healthcare costs eventually exceed the tax revenue, but not too low either, because the revenue is needed. It's a balancing act, managing a vice to maximize revenue while minimizing the political fallout from the deaths. The tobacco companies themselves have evolved. The major players, Philip Morris International, British American Tobacco, Imperial Brands, and Japan Tobacco International, are now truly multinational corporations with operations in nearly every country. They are sophisticated, well-funded, and politically connected. They employ armies of lobbyists who work to influence legislation at every level of government. They fund think tanks and front groups that produce studies questioning tobacco control measures. They threaten lawsuits and trade disputes when countries try to implement strong regulations. When Australia introduced plain packaging, the tobacco companies sued, claiming it violated intellectual property rights. They lost, but the legal battle cost the Australian government millions and sent a chilling message to other countries considering similar measures. The industry also engages in what it calls corporate social responsibility. Philip Morris International has a foundation that funds anti-smoking programs, particularly targeting youth smoking. On the surface, this looks like a company trying to do the right thing. In reality, it's a public relations strategy designed to buy goodwill and deflect criticism. The amount spent on these programs is a tiny fraction of what the company spends on marketing and lobbying. There's also the agricultural dimension. Tobacco farming provides income to tens of millions of people globally, from large plantation owners to small subsistence farmers. In countries like Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Bangladesh, tobacco is a critical export crop. Entire regional economies depend on it. Efforts to reduce tobacco cultivation run into fierce resistance from farming communities and the politicians who represent them. But the economics of tobacco farming are themselves exploitative. Most tobacco is grown under a contract farming system, where large tobacco companies provide seeds, fertilizer, and credit to farmers, who then sell their harvest exclusively to the company. The prices are set by the company, and they are often low. Farmers find themselves trapped in debt, unable to switch to other crops without losing access to credit. The work is also dangerous. Tobacco harvesters suffer from green tobacco sickness, a form of nicotine poisoning caused by absorbing nicotine through the skin when handling wet tobacco leaves. Child labour is rampant in tobacco-growing regions. Children as young as 10 work in the fields, exposed to nicotine and pesticides, missing school to help their families meet quotas. The industry's response to these criticisms is to point to the economic benefits: jobs, tax revenue, agricultural exports. They frame themselves as essential to economic development in poor countries. And in the narrow, short-term view, they're not entirely wrong. Tobacco does provide income and employment, but this is a devil's bargain. The economic benefits are front-loaded and visible. The costs, the healthcare expenses, the lost productivity from sickness and premature death, the environmental damage from deforestation and pesticide use, those costs accumulate slowly over decades. By the time they become apparent, the damage is done, and the region is locked into dependence on tobacco. It's a pattern we've seen before. The slave-grown tobacco of colonial Virginia generated enormous wealth for plantation owners and the British Crown. It built beautiful mansions and funded elegant lifestyles. But the human cost paid by enslaved Africans and their descendants dwarfed any economic benefit. The modern global tobacco economy operates on a similar logic, extracting wealth from the labor and addiction of the poor to enrich corporations and their shareholders. Breaking this cycle requires political will, international cooperation, and a willingness to confront powerful economic interests. It requires governments to prioritize long-term public health over short-term revenue. It requires wealthy countries to help tobacco-dependent economies transition to alternative crops and industries. None of this is easy, and all of it is fiercely resisted by an industry that has perfected the art of protecting its profits. We stand now at a strange moment in tobacco's long history. In the developed world, smoking is in decline, increasingly marginalized, socially unacceptable. In the developing world, it is still rising, a slow-motion catastrophe unfolding in real time. And in the middle, there are new technologies, new products, new questions about what the future might hold. Some public health experts have begun to talk about the tobacco endgame, a set of strategies designed not just to reduce smoking, but to eliminate it entirely within a generation. New Zealand has announced a plan to make it illegal for anyone born after 2004 to ever purchase tobacco. Each year, the legal smoking age will increase, eventually creating a smoke-free generation. Other countries are watching to see if the policy works, if it can be enforced, if it will withstand legal challenges. Another proposal is to mandate a dramatic reduction in the nicotine content of cigarettes, making them less addictive, less satisfying, less likely to create dependence. The FDA in the United States has considered this approach but has not yet implemented it. The tobacco companies have fought the idea vigorously, arguing that it would create a massive black market for high nicotine cigarettes. Others advocate for the sinking lid approach, gradually reducing the number of retailers allowed to sell tobacco until it becomes functionally unavailable, or for prescription-only tobacco, treating it like the addictive drug it is, requiring users to obtain it through a pharmacy after consulting with a healthcare provider. All of these approaches have merit, all have potential drawbacks. The question is not whether they could work in theory, but whether any society has the political will to implement them in practice, to withstand the lobbying, the lawsuits, the claims that it's prohibitionist overreach, nanny-state tyranny. The tobacco industry's response to the endgame talk has been to rebrand itself. Philip Morris International now claims it wants to create a smoke-free future. The company has invested billions in heated tobacco products like IQs, which heat tobacco without burning it, creating a nicotine-containing aerosol. They market these products as harm reduction, as a step toward a world without cigarettes. It's a clever strategy. It allows the company to position itself as part of the solution rather than the problem. It creates new revenue streams as cigarette sales decline, and it keeps customers addicted to nicotine, just in a different delivery format. Whether this represents genuine change or just the latest evolution in a century of manipulation is a matter of debate. The company's history argues for skepticism, but the products themselves may indeed be less harmful than cigarettes. Even if the company's motives are purely financial, the truth is that there is no single solution to tobacco. It is too deeply embedded in global agriculture, too profitable, too addictive, too entangled with government revenue and corporate power. Progress will be incremental, messy, and uneven. Some countries will move aggressively. Others will lag decades behind, their populations paying the price in preventable suffering and death. What we can say with certainty is that the age of smoking's cultural dominance is over. The Marlboro Man is dead, killed by the very product he advertised. The image of sophistication and rebellion that once clung to cigarettes has been replaced by images of diseased lungs and dying patients. The social acceptability that allowed people to smoke anywhere, anytime, with anyone has vanished. A child born today in the developed world will grow up in a world where smoking is rare, where cigarettes are hidden behind counters, where the idea of lighting up indoors is unthinkable. They will look at old movies and wonder why everyone is smoking. It will seem as alien as bloodletting or asbestos insulation, a bizarre practice from a less enlightened time. But that child's counterpart, born in Lagos or Jakarta or Manila, may well grow up in a world where tobacco is still everywhere, still marketed aggressively, still socially acceptable. That child may become the next customer, the next statistic, part of the billion deaths projected for this century. The weight of history. We return, at the end, to where we began, to a plant, to leaves that, when dried and burned, produce a smoke that humanity found irresistible. For thousands of years, that smoke was sacred, ritualized, controlled, and then it became commodity, capital, a driver of empires and enslavement. Tobacco's journey from the mountains of South America to every corner of the globe is a story of human ingenuity and human folly. We took a plant that indigenous peoples used with wisdom and restraint, and we industrialized it, mechanized it, addicted billions to it, and killed hundreds of millions with it. The companies that profited from this disaster are still with us, still operating, still selling cigarettes by the billions. They have paid fines and settlements, but no executive has ever gone to prison for the deaths caused by their products. The industry that lied for decades about the dangers of smoking, that manipulated nicotine levels to keep customers addicted, that marketed to children while denying it, has never faced true accountability. The governments that taxed tobacco, that became dependent on its revenue, that looked the other way while their citizens sickened and died, have never fully reckoned with their complicity. The physicians who once prescribed cigarettes for health, the scientists who took industry money to manufacture doubt, the advertisers who made smoking look glamorous, they are all part of this history. And so are the smokers themselves, though they are the victims, not the villains. People who started smoking because everyone around them smoked, because it looked cool, because they were stressed or bored or curious. People who found themselves unable to quit, not because they lacked willpower, but because they were chemically dependent on a drug delivered in the most addictive form possible. Nicotine is humanity's most legal poison. It's not the most acutely toxic. A cigarette won't kill you immediately like cyanide. But over time, over decades of use, it kills more reliably than almost anything else. And it does so while remaining legal, available, and until recently, socially acceptable. The death toll is almost incomprehensible. 100 million in the 20th century, a projected 1 billion in the 21st. Those numbers represent lives cut short, families destroyed, potential unfulfilled. They represent children who grew up without parents, partners who watched their loved ones suffocate slowly over years, communities hollowed out by preventable disease. There is no redemption arc in this story, no moment where the harm is undone or the dead are brought back. The best we can do is learn from it. We can recognize how corporate profit, government complicity, and sophisticated marketing can turn a dangerous product into a global pandemic. We can see how addiction is exploited rather than treated. We can understand that personal responsibility is a comforting myth when you're fighting against a chemically engineered dependence. The fight against tobacco is far from over. It will take generations to undo the damage, to eliminate smoking entirely, if that's even possible. But progress is being made. Smoking rates are falling in much of the world. Regulations are tightening. The industry's lies have been exposed. Young people are increasingly rejecting cigarettes. There is hope, cautious and hard-won, that perhaps humanity's long, deadly romance with tobacco can finally come to an end. That the smoke that once filled every room, every restaurant, every office can finally clear. That the sacred leaf, twisted into an instrument of death by greed and chemistry, can become a memory, a cautionary tale told to children who will wonder how we could have been so foolish. We stand in the aftermath of one of the greatest preventable tragedies in human history. The lesson is written in smoke and ashes, in hospital wards and cemetery plots, in the quiet, desperate gasping of millions who spent their last years drowning in air. The lesson is simple. Some things should never have been made convenient. Some pleasures cost too much, and some poisons, no matter how legal, how profitable, how deeply woven into the fabric of society, are still poisons. Tobacco taught us that. The question is whether we've learned it.